glad everyone is here this morning. I saw a video a little while ago of a snowstorm going through Lubbock. So if you're from anywhere north of here, you're probably very glad to be here. I guess that, I don't doubt we'll get snow, but that storm is coming our way, I guess, tomorrow. I don't have a note sheet this morning. Generally, I have a little note sheet to help keep you awake or to give for my kids. Just kidding, that's not just a kid. Or for my kids to be able to take notes. But I've decided to present this lesson a little bit differently than I normally present lessons. I think a traditional preacher or public speaking is an introduction and 3 points and a conclusion. And I rarely do that, whether good or bad. I still have a job, so I guess it's okay. But this morning I'm going to present the lesson in a way that my kids prefer to hear their Bible stories. And this one is smiling. My kids like stories. And so when we're on a trip, or when we are going to bed, except for last night, or the night before that, I tell them a story. I tell them a Bible story. And hopefully they enjoy it, and hopefully they don't fall asleep this morning. Because I'm going to tell you the story this morning of Esther. And I've written this out so that I will remember the points that I want to make. And the reason I've chosen to do this is because of my purpose in today's sermon. I do believe, from my background in education, that you start with your objective, what you want your audience to learn or to know, and then you develop the method to be able to best get that across. So I'm going to be putting up some visual learners, like things to be on the screen, and I will have Bible verses because the story of Esther comes from the Bible. But I have a reason for this, and hopefully you'll see that when we're done. Man, I got plenty of time this morning. Sorry, I don't mean to say that in a bad way. So anyway, the story of Esther, I don't know how many of you can see this map, to me begins in around 600 AD, when it so happened that the Babylonian army, led by King Nebuchadnezzar, conquered the nation of Judah, burned down the city of Jerusalem, and completely destroyed the temple of God. And all of God's people at that time, the Jews, Israelites, were either taken into captivity, as the map shows here, or they were killed. God's people had been judged. And then it so happened that the Persians conquered the Babylonians and stretched the empire to the edges of the known world. The Persians went so far west that they almost conquered the cities of Athens and Sparta in what we call present-day Greece. All of this occurred before the rise of the Greek Empire, and before there were Greeks, the Persians ruled the world. And then it so happened that in approximately 483 BC, the king of the Persians, King Ahasuerus, or King Xerxes, was planning a major military campaign against Greece. And he invited his leaders from across his empire to the capital city to make plans. After the plans had been complete, it so happened that there was a 7-day feast, a time of wine and eating and debauchery. And the king called for his wife. He called for Queen Vashti to come to the banquet hall and to show off her beauty before all of these drunk men and to perform. And Queen Vashti had other plans. She bucked the king, and so it happened that she refused to answer his call. Needless to say, the military and economic leader of the known world at this time was not very happy. And Queen Vashti lost her position as the first lady and was removed from her position of influence. The king even made a decree that all women are to give honor to their husbands, both great and small, and that the man should be the master of his own house. And then it so happened that 4 years after the deposition of Queen Vashti, and the Babylonians losing once again to the Greeks, that a replacement for Queen Vashti was sought. The most beautiful virgin girls from across the empire were brought to the capital city to vie for the vacant queen position. There was an almost year-long beauty contest that followed, and one contestant after another was given one evening with the king to try to convince him that she was the one. But it so happened that a seemingly reluctant entrant by the name of Esther won the favor of the king's appointed overseer of the contest. In fact, it seemed that the lovely Esther won the favor of just about everyone that she met. But most importantly, the king, King Xerxes, so happened to be smitten with her so much that he made her the new queen of Persia, the queen of his empire. This is literally a story of rags to riches, because it so happened that an orphan Jewish girl surviving in a foreign, ungodly land by the help of her uncle is suddenly thrust into the highest, most influential position that a woman could have at this time. She would have been the envy of every young maiden. And she would no longer live as a pauper, but she was quite literally the queen of the world. Her doting uncle Mordecai so happened one day to overhear two of the king's officials plotting a coup, plotting an assassination attempt on the king, on Esther's new husband. Without delay, Mordecai got word to his niece, who warned the king, who then gave credit to Mordecai for the information. And an investigation so happened to prove the validity of the coup attempt. And it so happened that it was ordered for this event to be written down in the book chronicling the life of the king. And then 5 years pass before the next part of our story takes place. And Esther, as queen, is living a life of peace and luxury. Her uncle, Mordecai, is working at the king's gate. And it so happened that a man by the name of Haman is promoted to being the king's right-hand man. Haman passes through the gate where Mordecai works on a regular basis. And it so happened that in the course of time, the king has decided that Haman is worthy of honor and respect, and that all should bow before him and pay homage in his presence. But Mordecai, being a devout Jew, refuses to do either and remains standing as Haman passes by. It so happened that Haman becomes enraged when he realized what Mordecai is doing. And in the course of his investigation is informed that Mordecai is a Jew. Haman's anger and desire for vengeance so happened to embolden himself to seek the destruction, to seek the annihilation of all of the Jews in the empire. Haman makes it his personal quest to remove the Jews from the face of the earth. And it so happened that Haman, a pagan, seeks the timing of his plan from the casting of lots. And it happens that the lot is cast for a date that is almost a year in advance. Haman is presumably pleased. He happens to have plenty of time now to work out and implement his evil plan. What more could he ask for? Shortly thereafter, Haman visits the king and warns him that there are a certain group of people in all the provinces of your kingdom whose laws are different than those of all of the other people. And they do not observe the king's laws. So it's not in the king's interest to let them remain. But Haman doesn't just present the problem to the king, he provides a solution. And it says, why don't you make a proclamation, O king, that they be destroyed? And I will provide you, O king, 10,000 talents of silver that you can add to the king's treasury. It just so happened that the king's response was, do with them as you please. And the king gave Haman his signet ring so that he could write up the decree of his choosing. The edict is issued and sent by the hand of couriers to all parts of the empire. As the king's decree is disseminated, his constituents are in an uproar. They're confused, bewildered, perplexed. But being oblivious to what is happening around them, Haman and the king sit down and have a drink. Mordecai, Esther's uncle, immediately learns of the Haman's plans. He tore his clothes, put on sackcloth, and went out into the midst of the city, wailed loudly and bitterly. In fact, the Jews throughout the empire are in mourning. They're fasting, weeping, wailing in sackcloth and ashes. And as time passes, Esther too learns of the decree. Her people are to be executed. Mordecai's message to her was to go to the king and implore his favor, but Esther is scared. She hasn't been called to see the king for an entire month. She knows that anyone who approaches the king without being called is in violation of the law and can be put to death immediately. Her only hope is for the king to hold out his golden scepter to her. In this way, the king allows only those who are completely trustworthy in his presence. Mordecai knows this as well, and he understands Esther's predicament. But his response to her is a telling one. He says, if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, and you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not attained royalty for such a time as this. And it so happens that Esther is convinced. She sets aside her fears, she places her life on the line, and she makes plans to willfully violate the law. She makes plans to approach the king in 3 days. But it so happens that she tells her uncle to gather all the Jews and to have them fast for her, night and day. And she and her maidens also fast, that she will not perish, because she's afraid for her life. She's scared. She knows what she has to do, but she is understandably very uneasy and uncertain of what her future holds. Then the third day arrives. Famished, apprehensive, yet resolute, she puts her most elegant clothing on, adorns her hair, takes a deep breath, and presents herself to the king in the entrance of the throne. And it so happens that the king once again gazes at his queen, and just like when they first met, he finds favor in her sight. He invites her into his arms and happens to be so enthralled with her that he asks her, what is your petition? I will give you anything up to half of my kingdom. Esther breathes a sigh of relief. Her life has been spared for the time being, and now is the moment she has been waiting for. But it so happens that now is not the right time to ask for him to spare her and her people. Her request this time is a simple one. She wants to invite the king and his faithful servant Haman to a banquet that she has prepared for them. The king is delighted. Haman is pleased to his heart. Things cannot get any better for Haman. His plan is progressing on schedule. Only the king is more powerful than him in the known world. And now the beautiful Queen Esther has asked him, and only him, to join royalty at a banquet. The king, the queen, and Haman enjoy a lovely dinner. At the end of the dinner, the king once again asks Esther, what would you have for me to do for you? And her response, once again, she does not ask for her people. Doesn't ask for their lives to be spared. But instead she asks, can you and Haman come to another banquet that I have prepared for both of you tomorrow? And the king agrees. Haman agrees. And Haman prances home to his wife, only to be brought back down to earth by the sight of the dreaded Mordecai. Mordecai refuses to bow, and Haman is infuriated. He confides in his wife and his friends that he can no longer stand this Jew Mordecai, and he can no longer wait till the appointed time. So it so happens that they advise him to build a set of gallows 50 cubits high and ask the king tomorrow to have Mordecai hanged on them. Haman loves the plan. He loves the plan so much that he can't wait to go to work the following morning. But it so happens that night that the king cannot sleep. He tosses and turns, finally calling for the records of the kings to be brought to him and read before him. And it just so happens that the passage chosen to be read was that of Mordecai saving the king's life. It also so happened that nothing was done at the time to reward Mordecai for his faithfulness to the throne. The king happens to decide it's time to honor Mordecai, but he is amiss to know exactly how to proceed. Well, it so happens that Haman is coming to work early. He wants to have Mordecai hung on the gallows that he has made. He is seeking an audience with the king, but the king is seeking advice. So it so happens that as Haman walks in, and before he can make his request, the king asks, what should be done to the one who the king wants to honor? Haman provides an answer, thinking that it has to be him. But it so happens that the king tells Haman to do all that you have proposed for Mordecai. For Mordecai, the one that Haman was just about to ask to be hanged. What a twist of fate. Mordecai is led through the streets of the capital on the king's colt, wearing the king's robe, by Haman himself. What irony. Haman has had enough. He runs home to be consoled by his family before heading back to the dinner date with the king and the queen. But this time it so happens that his family, and specifically his wife, is more perceptive than he is. She sees that this is a bad omen, that Mordecai now has the upper hand. But it just so happens that banquet number 2 is about to begin. Haman rushes off, and as they enjoy a pre-dinner drink, the king happens to ask, once again, what Esther would like from him. So it happens now that the moment is right. Queen Esther shares her fear for her life and the lives of her people. The Jews are in grave danger, and the king is oblivious to what he has decreed. The king responds by asking, who would do such a thing as this? The time is now right for Esther to reveal the wicked and evil plans that Haman has for her and for the Jews. The king is aghast and happens to flee from his own house into the palace garden. This is Haman's chance. Finally, alone with the queen, he begs for mercy. His begging leads him to falling on the couch where Esther is sitting. It so happens that the king returns at that exact moment and assumes the worst from Haman and has him immediately impaled on the gallows that Haman happened to have made that morning for Mordecai. It then so happened that the king grants Mordecai and Queen Esther the opportunity to write a new decree, a new edict that gives the Jews the right to defend themselves against their enemies on the day that Haman has chosen for their annihilation. And it just so happened that on this day, the Jews destroy their enemies. It also so happens that the king grants the Jews the right to defend themselves against their enemies the next day as well. And it so happens that 75,000 of the enemies of the Jews are killed on these 2 days. And as a result of all of this, Mordecai is promoted. And it so happens that Mordecai, the Jew, is now second in command only to the king himself. Esther continues as the queen. The Jews are saved, and a new feast day is established for the Jews throughout the world to remember Esther's braveness and her willingness to stand up to evil and to save her people. And they live happily ever after. This is the story of Esther. You might have noticed, or you might not have noticed, that I used the phrase, "it so happened," or "it happened," 48 times in this story. We don't know who, or we're never told who wrote the book of Esther. Some people say Ezra might have written the book. He came onto the scene years after this. Some say maybe it was Mordecai himself, while others say it was some unnamed author. But one thing we do know is that God is never mentioned in the book of Esther. And maybe it was Mordecai who wrote the book, and while Mordecai is still living and still working and still serving a pagan king, in writing his recollection of these events, maybe he chooses not to mention God for fear of offending his boss. Because when you read the book of Esther, if you don't know God, you're not going to see God. You're not going to see God's working. But if you know God, you understand the working of God. And that God is clearly evident throughout the book from beginning to end. Every so happened statement is not a chance or luck or good fortune or an accident or a fluke. It was the sovereignty of God. And I could have added more than 48, because when you look at it, there's 48 lucky events, I guess you could say, that takes place. But the Babylonians didn't so happen to attack the nation of Judah to destroy them and tear down the temple. God had been telling his people, the Jews, for years that this is what was going to happen, that judgment was coming if they didn't repent. And God used the Babylonians. He used King Nebuchadnezzar to execute his divine judgment on his people. And it was no accident that the Persian Empire destroyed the Babylonian Empire. It wasn't an accident because it was prophesied by Daniel 70 years before it happened. Because God knew what was going to happen. Because God knows what he's doing. And Queen Vashti refusing to answer the king's command was not a fortunate event for Esther. Esther didn't just get lucky with this. And it was at least 4 years after the time that Vashti is demoted before Esther becomes queen. What was Esther doing during that time? That 4 years? Well, the best we know, she was living her life. She was a teenage girl. She was living a God-fearing life, we presume. But she was going about her business. But God was going about his business. Esther wasn't lucky to be chosen to participate in the beauty pageant. She wasn't lucky that she was chosen to be queen. God was working in her life. God was using her beauty, or maybe her charm, or maybe her wit, or whatever it was, to prepare her for the act of faith that she was going to have to perform in order to save her people. All of this was done in order for God to save his people. But this saving of God's people is still in the future. For Esther is queen for a full 5 years before she's put in a position to use God's blessing. But God is working in her life. And it just doesn't so happen that Mordecai refused to pay homage to Haman, nor was the day of the Jews' destruction determined by fate or by chance. Everything along the way, throughout the story, God is working behind the scenes. Rhetorically, we may ask, why didn't Esther make her request to the king right when she presented himself to her? The king was so happy to see her. Why didn't she make the request to the king during the first banquet with Haman? We don't know. Why did she make her request to the king after Mordecai has been honored? Why did she wait to make the request after the gallows had been built? Why does she make the request when Haman is present? And why does the king happen to walk in right when Haman is falling over her? Why do all of these coincidences take place? Because that's what God wanted. That was God's plan. There may be no miracles per se in the story of Esther, but the sovereignty of God is clearly on display. Because while we don't know who actually penned the story of Esther, the author of the story of Esther is God. And God knew what he was doing. And so my point with this story this morning is that the true author of our lives is God. We make choices, we live our lives, but God's will be done. With or without our help, God's will be done. Just like it was in the story of Esther. God is probably not working miraculously in your life as we would consider miracles, but that doesn't mean that God isn't working. God is working in our normal times of our lives, like when Esther was the queen. God is working during the exciting times of our lives, like when Esther was spending a year in the king's household to see if she will be the next queen. God is working during the good times of our lives, like when Esther is being queen. But God is also working during our trying times. Our times when our faith has to be on display. We can never forget that God is there through the ups and downs of our lives. Just like he was with Esther when she was faced with a life and death decision. And then in the end, just like it happens in this story, we win. We win if we submit our will to the will of God. And we continue to allow God to work in our lives. If we are on God's side, if we have accepted God's invitation to be a part of his family, then we are going to be victorious. Just like Esther, when the story ends. And just like for us, when our story ends. And this then is the ultimate happy ending. This is the ultimate living happily ever after. Because we will be forever in the presence of God. I don't know what your story is. We talked a little bit in Bible class this morning. We've all come from different backgrounds, from different perspectives, from different lives, from different points of view. But God is working in your life. And I bet that as you look back on your life, you can see now, maybe with hindsight, how God has led you to where you are at right now. But I would say that God is not finished with you yet. And James is a perfect example of that.
Amen.
Because I visited with him, and there were times where he said, if this is what I have to keep going on, I don't want to be here anymore. But God has worked in his life, and God is working in your life for a purpose. I wish I could tell you what your purpose was. I wish I could tell you that you would be able to save God's people or save the country by your actions. But the most important thing is that we answer God's call. The call, the position that God puts us in to be used to further His will. However great or however small that might be. Live your life according to God's will. And if you haven't accepted Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior, if you haven't put your will in line with God's will, then we want to offer an invitation. We want to offer a time where you can either learn more about that, or you can put Christ on in baptism, whether you can turn your life back around if you have already given your life to God, want to start anew. We give that opportunity as we offer an invitation every morning as PD leads us in a song.